Sure. So I'm going to start with the social inclusion part of the question. And I think one thing that is clear the world over is that having the capacity and the power to determine social memory and commemoration and how the past is understood not just in a formal academic sense, but in an everyday sense, is very much a reflection of social power and authority. And we see communities who have been excluded through long-standing historical processes that are very much about long histories that are hard to overturn. We see those communities very much calling into question the official version of the past that they encounter in elementary school curricula, in museums, on television, and also in the kind of scholarly books and articles that those of us who teach and research history professionally produce as well. So in that sense, I think there's a really intimate and powerful connection between social exclusion and marginalization and power and social memory. And those things obviously track a little bit towards democracy in a formal political sense, but I think they also kind of stretch beyond it. So I'm going to think about democracy here in ways that go beyond just the formal kind of exercise of the right to vote. But I'll also just sort of benchmark the fact that access to those institutions has been variable along all of these differentials of gender, of race, of indigeneity in the Canadian context, and very much so within recent memory. And so we can sort of sometimes use democracy as sort of as a code for a kind of egalitarian politics that people participate in. But we also work in a Canadian context where status Indians did not have the right to vote until 1960, which is not any long time ago, and where the struggles, for instance, to extend the suffrage to women on the same terms as men accommodated those differences. And so some women got the right to vote starting in 1917. But the real answer to the question is, when do women get the right to vote in Canada, is 1960. So democracy is contested, and it continues to reflect all sorts of those aspects of kind of power, some of them formal in the sense of who has the right to vote, some of them less formal in the sense who can actually access that right, like who isn't working 3 jobs and overwhelmed and unable to get to the polling station on the correct day. And some of them just even less formal in the sense about who sees themselves as somebody who has a stake in mainstream democratic and deliberative institutions. But I do think we have seen how memory politics can really call into question some of those sort of institutions. In the province where I live and work right now, Manitoba, the last sitting premier, more or less was kind of hounded out of office for his, egregiously inaccurate and damaging understanding of Indigenous history and its relationship to the place that he works in a province that is probably about 20% Indigenous by any reckoning, and that's probably a bit of an undercount. That failure to learn, that failure to speak in a reasonable way to the province that he governed and to understand its history ultimately became a real political issue for people. And one of the central reasons that kind of saw him kind of pushed out of office. So I think we can see how people are looking for versions of the past that they can see themselves and their communities in. And that happens in a number of respects, but it also happens in the political realm. And I think people want that from democratic institutions. Though sometimes the way that those changes are sought actually happen outside of kind of formal democratic politics. And on one hand, I think, there has always been contests over history and historical memory. I think we're at a moment where there's forms of communicating it, including through sort of social media and online mechanisms, which are far from universal. And we live in a country where access to the internet is not consistent across the board. It cuts along very particular lines. And there are many people in communities who are excluded from online communication. But for people who have access to the internet, we have, witnessed a world where people have the capacity to kind of produce versions of history in the past and disseminate it in ways that go beyond their local families and communities and networks of friends and relations and reach wider audiences. So I think it's partially a moment of communication. But I think it's also a moment where perhaps we're thinking about the present. I think pandemics, have all sorts of ongoing reckonings. I've spent a lot of time these last 3 years thinking about 1918 and 1919 and 1920, because that pandemic also stretched on a long time. And the 20s that follow the end of the influenza pandemic of 1918 through 20, maybe 21, was a very difficult decade in the Canadian context. It saw a real rise of kind of anti-immigrant racism. It saw the kind of the growth and sort of calcification of residential schooling, which was the system was at its height in the interwar era. It saw the Indian Act change to take on kind of newly coercive and restrictive aspects. And in lots of ways, it was, a really grim kind of moment where a lot of the kind of gains that had sort of happened from kind of equity-seeking groups were really rolled back. So I think maybe pandemics make us think about the past. They make me think about the past a little bit. But I think we're in a moment where a lot of people have access to ways of communicating it. And I think it's about the 20th century, and in ways that are probably more true in some contexts than in others. But I also think it's about other moments as well. And I'm thinking about, the 1619 project in the United States, which takes a moment of history, which is, early modern time. It is not recent, and has become a real kind of fascinating and important example of the way history can be remade, in that case through the lens of Black scholars and writers, and also the way that those views have been contested by people who have a lot at stake in other versions of the past. And sometimes those are people who are kind of invested in kind of a conservative white version of American history, but it also has brought out voices who I wouldn't have expected. So we're very much kind of, a generation of white male historians who have kind of not responded in the kind of generosity that would perhaps one would have expected to that project. But there we see what is quite old history becoming a flashpoint, and also becoming kind of a crucial point in debates about this teaching of what is supposedly called critical race theory in the American context. So it's about the 20th century, but it's also sometimes about earlier periods of time. But I think there is about the moment where there are certain moments that speak to the present and in important ways, and we're seeing how that kind of plays out.